Hello, and welcome to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast, a podcast all about constructing your career in neurology. I'm your host for this episode, Sana Aslam from the Barrow Neurological Institute. Today, as part of the Contract and Work series, we're going to be talking with Dr. Hannah Homafar, a neuromuscular trained neurologist at the Methodist Physicians Group, about knowing your worth in the non-academic world. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today, Hannah.
It's my pleasure. I'm really excited to be here and talk about this.
So, Hannah, when we hear the term knowing your worth, can you tell us a little bit about what that means or what that should mean to us as physicians?
Yeah, so I think for me, that means that as a physician, you are the one generating the income for your employer. So you're the one that has that specialized skill that you're bringing to the table. You're the one that's providing the service. You're the reason why they can pay for their facilities and their administrators and their staff. And so as the income generator, you are the one that needs to be aware of being fairly compensated, being fairly treated, not taken advantage of, so to speak, so that you can have a career where you're more satisfied, not burnt out or resentful. And I just think this is so important for our longevity, especially with medicine, because it's a stressful career.
Very much so. And I think, a lot of times these are things that we don't really think about when we're in training. We're focused on, learning the medicine and perhaps not necessarily this aspect of the job. Do you feel like this was something you knew out of training, or is this something you've kind of learned along the way by making mistakes, if you will?
I absolutely had no experience with this coming out of training, and a lot of it I've learned through tough lessons personally. And I would be so happy if people who are currently in fellowship and residency can hear more about this so that they're way more empowered than I was coming out of training and coming to the negotiating table with these hospitals.
So when we're talking about kind of knowing your worth, I think one of the first things that most of us think about is salary and, the actual value of your income and what you're earning. Can you tell us a little bit about how you kind of determine how physicians can determine what an appropriate salary should be?
Yes, there's data out there for this specific reason that hospitals have, and it's not our fault necessarily if we don't know, because the data is kind of hidden or expensive to get your hands on. That's where physician groups can be super helpful, because this data can be shared. There are things like MGMA. So MGMA is essentially data collected over all subspecialties and specialties. And they are basically reporting out for every specialty, the 5th, the 100th percentile of what that particular subspecialist makes in salary or in dollar per RVU, and what the percentages are of what that specialty generates in RVU per year. And this is the kind of data you need to know when you come to the negotiating table. If you don't know what's the 50th percentile or what's average for your specialty, you're giving the hospital the upper hand. They're going to come to you, and they love to talk about fair market value. They love to say, you know what, we have to make sure that what we're offering you is compatible with fair market value. And they're going to try and convince you that their low ball offer is fair. And you might be very easily convinced of that if you don't know the numbers and if you don't know the data. And so the more you know, the better you can come to that negotiating table informed and say, you know what, I thank you so much for bringing up fair market value, because I know that the 50th percentile of pay for neurology is, 300 something thousand. And I actually don't know the current numbers. And that's where physician groups like this, podcasts like this, are super helpful, because we need to collectively be aware and collectively share and empower each other as a specialty, so that we're not signing bogus numbers and giving these hospitals the upper hand.
That's really helpful to know. And I don't think, in training that I even knew that this information existed. Now, is the MGMA data something that is accessible freely to everyone? Is it something that is collected through the AAN? Like, where is this information coming from and how do we access it?
So I know that AAN does have information, but MGMA data is not freely accessible. I think it's very expensive to get your hands on. So it's something that has in the past been passed to me by friends, or I had seen some lesser detailed data, posted in some of our physician groups that we're a part of. And so, you want to build your network and you want to ask around and you want to try to get your hands on the most latest numbers that you can get.
That's really helpful to know. Thank you. Going back a little bit, when we talk about salaries and, hospitals offering contracts, I think I've heard a lot of people say that they were told that, this is especially for larger hospitals or larger groups, that this is a standard contract, that there isn't much room for negotiation. Has that been your experience particularly when it comes to sort of a base salary?
That's not my experience at all. My experience has been that every aspect of the contract is negotiable, including your pay. I do think that in some non-academic settings that it could be more rigid. For example, like a government job with the VA. My very first job out of training was with Kaiser Permanente, which of course partners or works with it's essentially an HMO patients. And, some of the wording in these kinds of contracts may be a little bit more rigid or difficult to change. But since that time, every hospital group that I've gotten a contract from, I've been able to negotiate beyond what I was even able to imagine. So you really want to think outside of the box, and you really want to be primed for the fact that you need to negotiate and you need to ask for what you want. And I will tell you, my experience is that I have never had a hospital walk away from me just because I asked for something. I've never had them leave the negotiating table just because I asked. So don't be afraid to ask for what you want.
I think a lot of times we forget, like you said earlier, that we are providing a service that is absolutely vital for for the industry, for the healthcare industry. They cannot function without healthcare workers. And so I think remembering that is probably really helpful too, when we go to negotiate.
Oh yeah, especially as a neurologist. I mean, we're in high demand. There's not enough of us. Everybody wants a neurologist, and they're going to try and tell you, well, neurology doesn't generate as much income and this, that, or the other. You need to put all of that out of your mind and don't be afraid to ask for what you want. I'll share a really quick story. I interviewed once with a very small private hospital in for me and my husband was a very undesirable area. I knew they wanted a lot from me. They were going to want me to work really hard for them. It was going to be a lot of elbow grease from me because they didn't have a neurologist already. So it was going to take a lot to build up what they wanted. And I also knew I was going to have no access to subspecialty care. So they offered me a very, very average salary of $300,000. And I countered them, and this is going to sound wild, but I countered them $440,000. And that night when I sent off the email, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, and I thought, there is no way they're going to respond to me. They're going to ghost me. And to my surprise, that morning, I got an email from them and they came up $50,000. And they didn't ghost me, and they didn't walk away from me just because I negotiated. And of course, you don't want to come into the table guns blazing, asking for a lot of stuff. This is after, you get to know them. They interviewed you. They like you. They see the value you can bring. You shared good ideas with them. They see your value, and you prove your value to them. Like, look, I can do this. This is what I'm going to bring to the table. This is what I'm going to help you build. This is how it's going to feed into your rehab service, your cardiology service, your radiology service. And they know that already, and they'll negotiate with you. So don't be afraid to ask. And I had to learn that from a male colleague of mine, because as a female, I never asked for stuff when I came out of training. And I think we need to definitely have a mindset shift on that.
So that's actually a really great story, and it segues really well into my next question is how do you, so, we know what we should be paid or what we want to be paid. How do we share and express the value that we're bringing? How do we make sure we verbalize or at the negotiating table, make it clear, well, this is why you should be paying me more than what you're offering?
Well, knowing the data helps. And knowing the MGMA data definitely will empower you, because you're not going off of just making stuff up. You're coming to them with statistics and numbers. And so for me, I was able to kind of basically tell them, look, it's going to be very hard for me and my husband. My husband's going to move here with me. He's not going to have earning power. So in order to recruit a high quality neurologist, you're going to need to be closer to like 80th, 90th percentile of what other people are paying. Like you're just going to have to do that. And they didn't disagree. They disagreed with the actual number, but they came up. And that's the point. Like, you're trying to find something that is more middle ground that can satisfy you both. And the more you know the statistics and the data, the more empowered you're going to be and the more logical you sound. And who can argue with numbers, right?
That's fair. So we've kind of talked about salary and that value, but there are other things in the contracts, and I think that are also valuable to us at a professional level, but also a personal level. Things like time off and parental leave and benefits. What are some other things that you would say that we should think about beforehand and know that's important to us, and then be able to negotiate that?
Yeah, so I'm actually looking through a contract that I have right now that I recently got from my employer, because I'm renegotiating terms. So by the way, spoiler alert, once you start a job with a hospital and based on how things are going, especially if they perceive you to be valuable, you work hard, you have good press ganey scores, whatever, by the way, later you can renegotiate terms if things need to be adjusted. But first and foremost, you're going to want to know what's the time frame of your contract, right? So like are they coming at you with a 5-year contract? Do you feel more comfortable signing a 2-year contract? Like, you need to know that. They're going to specify hours. Okay, are you signing a 40-hour-a-week contract, or do you want to negotiate admin time and you want to be 36 hours or 32 hours? You need to negotiate that. They're going to go through, of course, the restrictive covenant. That's super important. What is your restrictive covenant if you leave? That's really, really, really important that you fully understand and that you're comfortable with signing. If you sign a 15-mile non-compete in a city, I mean, that's boxing you out of practicing medicine, essentially, and you need to be careful what you're signing on that. There's going to be a lot of terms about how they can terminate you for cause. You've got to be careful what you're signing there, especially if it's a smaller group. Like, if you just have a personality conflict with someone, and they can easily terminate you, and on top of that, you're stuck now with a non-compete, you need to be careful about what you're signing there. And then going on, there's a lot of things that you need to be careful about in the fine print that a lot of times we gloss over. And so I strongly recommend everyone have a good contract lawyer. And above that, follow your gut, because sometimes lawyers don't give you the best advice. So if you're getting advice from a lawyer, but your gut tells you, I don't know, I don't think this doesn't sit well with me, follow your gut always. And then also, you need to be very careful when you're signing a hospital contract. A lot of them want to own your intellectual property. So they're going to put clauses in the contract that say, hey, once you sign on with us and you work for us, you can't go do other things for pay. You can't go give talks for pay. You can't do side things in medicine for money. Or if you invent something while you're under the terms of our contract, we want to own that too. And you need to be very careful with these clauses that you're signing and be very, very aware of them. And that's just going into things that are outside of benefits. Because a lot of times we just think about PTO pay, whatever, but there's way more depth of like what you're signing on to that it's super important to be aware of.
Yeah, I think, we, of course, like I said, value, we think salary, but there's so much more about what is valuable to our lives and our professional lives and personal lives and how our work plays into that as well. I'm going to take a little detour here. And, so while we're talking about value, I think in the academic world, sort of promotion and professional growth is probably a little better outlined, or at least we're taught better about what that means and what promotion means. In the non-academic world, how does that translate? Does it mean, partner track, or does it mean a higher salary? Like what has that looked like for you, and what should some of our listeners think about when they think about incorporating professional development and growth into their contracts?
That's actually a really interesting topic, and one that I don't have experience with personally, because my job is very basically outlined on, this is your RVU target. So I'll just share, like, mine is right around 5,000 work RVUs. And these are your targets for, what we want you to be at for patient satisfaction overall. And if you earn more than this, then you get some bonus. It's very, it does kind of bring up the fact that I'm 100% employed and I don't have a partnership track. And, what does that mean for a physician in what you value, what you want? And that's something personally I would love to hear a podcast about.
As a sidebar for our listeners, we will be going over what RVUs mean, what work RVUs mean, what those numbers actually mean, and then we'll also have some discussions about other models of private practice and what being a partner means.
I want to briefly kind of also bring up, when it comes to contract negotiations, when it comes to things like sign-on bonus and moving expenses covered, loan forgiveness. What I would just say to the listeners is you want to understand the terms of those agreements, because they are going to come with strings attached. So if your job is offering you a $20,000 or $40,000 sign-on bonus, well, what are the strings attached to that? And usually what it will be is that it's going to lock you into the contract for a period of time. And if you do break a contract sooner than that time, then you may have to pay a portion of this back. And so you just need to be sure that you're comfortable with understanding that. And I generally advocate that you want to make sure that if your life circumstance changes and you need to make a change, that the penalty for you to break a contract is not going to be overburdensome for you.
That's really helpful to know. I think sometimes we forget about the fine print, if you will, with some of these things. Along those lines, we've had, if are there certain aspects of the contract that perhaps were not included in the initial contract, things like a sign-on bonus or parental leave or loan forgiveness that you knew were valuable to you and important for you to include, that you were able to negotiate into a contract?
Well, now I would say, and I've learned this from some of the male physicians again, especially surgeon physicians, that they ask for staffing. And that has never occurred to me. And it's hugely important, especially if you're production based. How is your organization going to help your infrastructure support you being a good, thriving practice? Are they supporting you enough for you to be able to do what it is that you need to do? And I am now a big fan of this idea of asking for your support staff. So if you are in a hospital employed setting and you do EMG and you're production based, well, you're probably going to want the opportunity to work with a technician, because if not, you're spending all the time doing the technical work, which slows you down and it may hurt your numbers. And so that's something now that I, in the future, would strongly consider, is asking for even the pieces of support that I would need, that I know I would need to be as successful as I can be. And I learned that from the male physicians. They put in things like their equipment. They put in that this is what they want for their staffing. They put in that want their first assist, for their first assist. And they're negotiating all of that. And we should be able to do that in the hospital setting as well. And I believe my current employer would be responsive to that if I had asked for it. And that's just time and experience that's, brought up to me these important elements that I had never thought to ask for before.
Yeah, I don't think that would have occurred to me, at least, if not many of us, to kind of negotiate support staff, essentially. Have you found, or is it your experience or understanding that when you do negotiate for a neurology specific nurse or an MA that works just for you, or an EMG tech, that negotiation comes at the expense of something out of your income or salary?
So really great question. So I've never worked with a PA before myself. And part of my plan from my employer is in order to increase accessibility to the clinic, they would love to explore this idea of me supervising a physician assistant. Well, what they said is they want me to pay for the PA. So if the PA does not produce above the cost of the PA, that they would take that out of my earnings, which we negotiated that, and we negotiated that I would not do that. And so you need to be careful. Also, we would negotiate, and we're in negotiations currently for what I would be able to earn for myself as a result of being the supervising physician, because in a hospital, this is a business. In a hospital setting, they're very business minded, and you don't want to be spending time doing things for free for them. You really shouldn't be. If it was a physician-owned group and you brought on a PA, you would make money off of that. So you want to be careful that you're not just giving services away for free.
Hannah, thank you so much for spending time with us and talking to us about kind of knowing your worth, and particularly how it applies to contract negotiations. And this has been really helpful for me, and hopefully it has been really helpful for our listeners as well. Before we sign off, any last words of wisdoms or things that we should be thinking about that you wish that you knew when you had first started your journey?
The moral of the story is ask for what you want. And even after you sign on and a couple of years have gone by, you can continue to ask for what you want and renegotiate. I've never had anyone walk away just because I asked. And I would love for listeners to join into the comments and share, because I want to continue learning from other people. And I'm just really thankful for these kinds of communities.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks.
That was our episode with Dr. Hannah Homafar, talking about knowing your worth in the non-academic world as part of our Contracts and Worth series. As a note, this podcast is not recorded as an official podcast of any institution or organization. The podcast is unfunded. Opinions are those of the individual participants. Music by Audrey Nath, artwork by Shivani Ghoshal. Want more content like this? Be sure to subscribe to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast on all major platforms to hear more about constructing your career in neurology. Follow us on Twitter at NeuroBolts to stay up to date on new content and give us feedback on what you want to hear, and tell your friends. Thanks for joining us.